to Open Banking Limited's Innovation Exchange here at Open Banking Expo, and this panel on breaking barriers with cross-sector collaboration. I'm Emily Rayment, I'm Head of Public Affairs at Open Banking Limited, and I'm joined by a great panel. We have Paul Albone, who is Non-Exec Director at Open Property Data Association, Adrian Field, Director of Market Development at OneID, Leon Ifayemi, Director of Coalitions and Research at CFIT, and Gavin Starks, Founder and CEO of IcebreakerOne. So, as I said, this session is all around cross-sector collaboration, and we now have the Data Act, which is laying the foundations for smart data across all sectors. And as we know, a lot of the value is going to come from multi-sector use cases. So that's what we're going to talk about today. How do we really get there across sectors, and how do we make use of some of the things that we've already got, like open banking? So to kick us off, I'm going to start with Leon. At CFIT, you work a lot with bringing different stakeholders together across sectors. So what are the kind of common technical standards and governance frameworks that you see that can drive that multi-sector innovation?
Thanks, Emily. I mean, so just by way of background, the Centre for Finance, Innovation and Technology convenes lots of different stakeholder groups to try to solve problems. And our fourth coalition is focused on smart data, particularly looking at open property and home buying as a use case. I think one of the challenges and opportunities that we're seeing really is that there are sort of two entity types that can own goods and services generally. You've got individuals and you've got companies. I think as a country, as an ecosystem, we've done quite well on building out standards for individuals and data sharing enablers such as digital ID. DCIT at the moment, the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology own the standards for individual IDs. At CFIT, we've written a comparable standard for digital IDs for corporates, for companies. And what we think will happen is that we'll have sort of complementary standards for data packs or for IDs for various different core asset classes that we want to exchange, right? Property might be the first one. I mean, we're all aspirational home buyers in the UK. And so wouldn't it be great if I had a wallet of my own and you had one of yours, Emily, and if I were to buy your property, the token around that property that you own would just transfer from yours to mine. And the standards that govern those API protocols, the sharing of data, the movement of data in that exchange would be governed by this central government department. So we need to go and create those standards and the regulations that create the guardrails on how that process can occur. And I think provided that that's done, we should have that fluid exchange of assets, services and digital goods in ways that we previously haven't seen.
And you mentioned property, so I'll turn to Paul to continue on this. So obviously with open property, we're cutting across a number of different sectors, financial and non-financial. How would you maybe build on what Leon said, and also how you build that trust between the sectors?
Yeah, well, I suppose I've got to applaud the ambition of starting with the most complex use case that we could probably think about, being a property transaction. I represent the Open Property Data Association, and we spent the last 4 or 5 years developing a data standard that begins with that listing and the upfront information agenda and is beginning to go right through. So a property ID is part of where we start that journey. And then we build up the identity of that property. But you're quite right, it's a complex transaction. We've got multiple stakeholders and multiple silos of data that exist across that. I think ID is one of the ones that we can probably talk about shortly, but an ID check is done on a homeowner 4-5 times during a transaction, because there aren't the levels of trust and interoperability across those different silos in the transaction. And so I think as a home mover, unfortunately, it's not something we tap in and out of every day. Certainly we might be aspirational homeowners, but currently it's every 17 years we might perform that transaction. And so there's lots of unknowns in that. And we need to break those barriers down from the estate agency sector, the conveyancing sector, the lenders, the intermediaries, the ID providers. And so trust frameworks, smart data is a fundamental pillar of initially being able to achieve that. Because if we're going to accept transmission of data across them, the trust, the provenance, and the governance around access control is fundamentally important in that transaction.
Thank you, Paul. Gavin, I want to come to you next. So in the energy space, you've obviously done a lot that has been industry driven, which is, very, very admirable. So how do you get that success? How do you bring people together and make these initiatives stick and see that ongoing progress?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it is hard to get people to go far together. The only way that we found of really creating collaborations that stick is to have them being purpose-based. And so whether that purpose is social purpose, whether it's profit, but it has to have a business value in order to get people to both show up and to stick around. IcebreakerOne's a non-profit focused on data governance, and we do two things. One is we do bring people together under common purpose umbrella, and then we operate a trust framework as a service, which we built as a completely open source stack as a public digital infrastructure. With the kind of initiatives we're running, we've got National Grid and SSE as members of Open Energy. We've also got a cross-sector program looking at how can you use smart meter data from an electricity smart meter to help underwrite green lending, which is a huge value chain, huge supply chain of data with not just different organizations, but different regulatory umbrellas covering different parts of that ecosystem. And I'd say, in the design of that program, which is called Perseus, we've got a dozen banks signed up. We've got 30 or 40 carbon accounting providers, including some of the incumbents like Sage, and a whole range of energy data providers. If we hadn't had a very clear purpose of reduce cost and friction of green lending, we'd still be talking about the theory. And in actual fact, we've been able to bring together over 200 people for 2 years to design and create a scheme which is entirely voluntary, and that is now leading to the deployment of funding. So that purpose-led piece is really fundamental to keeping people in the tent.
That's absolutely true. We see across now that more and more smart data sectors are developing, we see the same things like development of trust frameworks and standards and consent frameworks. And something that we talk about and think about is how can we make sure we are all using the same interpretations, we are taking the same approaches to build that interoperability. So I'd be interested in the perceptions from what you see of how that's going or how we can improve on that.
I'd like to come in a bit on that, because I think you're absolutely right. We're the smart data, Paul made a great point, right? The smart data landscape is incredibly complex. And at the moment, we're developing a lot of the technologies, the schemes, and our concepts around what smart data should be in scheme areas and in silos, right? So, open property's got its own thing going on, open transport's got its own thing going on, open energy has got its own thing going on. And the question is, how do we make this interoperable in the future? I think there are a couple of key components. The first is that at the moment, there aren't any core centralized owners of the standards that these various different scheme area developers are creating, right? And what that means is it means that what you might get is some variance in how those schemes are enforced and the components of those various different schemes. For example, if we look at what we're doing with open property and the great standard that the OPDA has created, there's a question about whether that should be sat with the land registry, who ultimately is underwriting this for property, could underwrite this for property, or whether it could sit with the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, because they already own a standard for individual IDs, and as sort of thinking about technology being the emulsifier of all these various different industries, potentially could also own it there. So I don't think we've come to an agreement on what that looks like. and reaching some conclusion on that, I think, will get us to the next space. I'll give another example to double down on why this is so important. Regulation. So digital IDs can be used across pretty much any sector. If you use digital ID for a financial services use case, the appropriate regulator to assert consequence is the FCA. If you're using it in a communications use case, the comparable regulator there is Ofcom and Ofgem for energy, and so on and so forth and so on and so forth. What this means is we as consumers don't know where to go to ask the right questions about what happens when there's mismanagement of our data. Who is it? And the complexity, I think, is it gets worse when a lot of the use cases are cross-sector and are mixed, right? So in property, you often get a mix of energy use cases, property use cases, comms use cases, and a bit there. And what I feel is that we need potentially either a new data regulator that sits at the center of the data sharing universe, or we repurpose one of the existing regulators, such as the ICO, for that, with that intent. And of course, they can work with then the sort of a very sector-specific regulators like the FCA on a needs basis. But at least the first point of call becomes that data regulator that consumers trust and understands how they're sharing data across a number of different sectors, not just one. Right? So interoperability is the core piece there.
Do we have some responses? Do we need a data regulator?
So I think we already have one. So I'm Adrian Field from OneID. So we're a digital identity verification service provider. We also do age assurance under Ofcom for the Online Safety Act, and we do online banking account information service provider. So we're already in multiple trust frameworks and authorised for those things. So we've got FCA permissions for open banking. We've got DCIT certification under the UK accreditation service for the set of rules. So essentially all these things are one part of government or regulation will write the rules of the road. What are the sets of rules for open competition in that sector? People can then build services and get them certified for that set of rules. And there's a governing body or regulator or both that make sure that you're adhering to what they do. And there's clear pathways and positioning and communications to your customers and your users as to who's providing the service, what's your data sharing consent, what to do when it goes wrong, who to call, all those kind of things. So I think you've got to build all these things into the framework.
If I come onto that, I think designing for humans is quite important. We know that technically you could have one trust framework for the country. Technically you could have one legal framework for all data sharing. And technically you could have one political party running the entire country. Practically, that isn't how humans work. And it's also not how industry works. And so we do have a very challenging road ahead of us to work out where the lines of responsibility lie, where they start and where they end. And what we have observed in some cases is that government regulators and others can either understep and not be specific enough in the definition of the rules, or they can overstep and go too far into what should be really determined by the commercial sector. And there's a great quote just to really highlight, I think, some of the challenges ahead. If you think about Lego bricks and how they are all stuck together, other companies now make Lego, but they don't quite fit. So you buy your kids some non-Lego brand, and then you spend months unpicking it. This was from Marie Walker presentation yesterday. You spend months unpicking the non-official Lego from the Lego box of your kids to plug it all together. So we can talk about interoperability and say, yes, they kind of look like they're fitting together, and it's certainly better than it used to be. But where are we introducing cost and friction into this equation? And where are we reducing cost and friction? And again, I come back to the only way to get people to come to the tent and stay in the tent is around purpose. But when you're purpose-led, you're not really thinking about how do we make this interoperable, like between banking and health and property and so on and so forth. So it's not a solved problem. And I'm not sure that we will solve it. Because then you need to take a view of, well, how did we get here in the first place with the web? And I was fortunate to work with Sir Tim Berners-Lee. Certain elements, yes, you can do globally. But what happens when Apple turns up?
I'm an optimist, so I will respectfully disagree. But I do think that there is I think that you can actually, purpose and interoperability aren't at odds with each other, right? So the question is, what purpose is going to bind all of those interdependent stakeholders and create equilibrium between their various different incentives to move everyone forward in the right direction and in the same direction? I think the data sharing and ID landscape is going to be an important part of that, right? Because, ultimately digital ID providers are incentivized by their very nature to solve the interoperability problem on our behalf, right? I'm collecting data from property, from ID sources, from government, from all sorts of various different sources, making sure it all works, and then, I can use that wherever it needs to go. The ID, that's the entire purpose of the existence of ID companies. However, I do think that they need guardrails around them, and that's the role that government might play in protecting consumers as digital IDs providers go on that journey. The market is still not at maturity yet, so I understand Gavin's sentiments. I think there's a lot of complexity that we've got to get through, but we've already identified the stakeholder group who's going to take ownership of this. This is companies like Adrian's, right? And no pressure, right? And we've already identified the various different government departments who we feel should own this. I think we've just got to keep moving forward.
Go on, Paul.
Yeah, I think I agree with a lot of what's being said there, and I think it's actually no longer a technology problem. It is one of appetite for change and collaboration. The technology does exist, in open banking. It doesn't exist in property at the moment, and the interoperability word, I can never say that. I need to learn how to say that, shouldn't I? But that is one of the fundamental pillars that we need to do. And I think, you mentioned that we've got a regulator already. Well, in a singular space we may have, but not across, come back to the property transaction. And I think that's where some of the barriers are still going to exist. Even if we solve the technology problem, even if providers are authenticated and certified at a level that's acceptable, it's the regulators of each of those disciplines across the property transaction still have to have a level of agreement as well. And there's sort of too many vested interests in what is a total disaggregated market through estate agency, conveyancing, and the technology vendors. And I think, as a technology person at heart, I'm disheartened by the adoption of technology that, as I say, does now exist, but there's an apathy. It's either too expensive to implement, or I'll just wait. I'll wait to see where it goes. And I think that's the biggest barrier to adoption, actually. The people just sitting there going, I'm going to wait a while.
Yeah.
Adrian.
And I do think, we have the standards for everything, they already exist. It's something only really becomes a standard when it gets adoption. And this is where you see in the EU with the EIDAS framework, where the government's actually stepping in and say, this is the standard, everyone needs to use this one. The UK government is then copying that for their government wallet and which is a good thing, because it forces you to have that interoperability. Everyone knows what the standard is, and you don't have to pick one out of half a dozen of them. So I think that's a good approach. And start with the global standards, and then it's easier.
Talking a lot about the role of government, but what do we think they could usefully do in this space? So we're talking a bit about governance, but also a lot of the data that might be useful will come from government. So how do we really feel that governments can play a role in driving progress forward?
In fact, comment on that, I think government faces the same challenge or similar challenges as industry. We've got to culturally think about data as infrastructure, and the value of data increases the more it's connected. And we still have a lot of legacy thinking about, well, we just need to build a big database or a castle and a moat, and then all the problems get solved. That thinking is still massively prevalent across all organizations, including government departments. And it's just not the way that the world works anymore. And so we need to help everybody upskill into how to think about connected data and smart data in the mix. The way that government can help. And I think we've got the Smart Data Council in the UK, which I'm a member of. Its role is to try and help shape what this turns into and how we can best create the feedback loop between government and industry around what actually works and where the boundaries should lie. And this comes back to, when you ask 12 government departments to go off and design something, you'll get at least 40 different answers. So back to some of the points here, how do we create a cohesive and joined up future here? It's really hard work. I'd say that the challenge, part of the challenge is we need to force ourselves to all stay in the room and thrash it out. And then certainly in the development of open banking, it's actually 10 years ago this year that I co-chaired the development of open banking. There was a moment where we had to just get everybody in a room and lock the doors until we agreed. I think there's going to be a few more moments like that where we need to bring everybody together and thrash it out.
Yeah, I think, again, in the property sector, we do try and get quite a few people in the room. Leon and I were at a meeting last week where there was a lot of people in the room. But there are some individuals in that room going, yes, but I heard this in 2017, nothing's moved on. It's the same problem. Well, actually, the problem's the same, but I think it's a little disingenuous to say it hasn't moved on because we have seen steps in the right direction, but it's a big problem we're trying to solve here. And so it does. Those people can be in the room, but they need to leave the room still believing in what we're trying to achieve as a collective, and that's again the harder part, I think.
Absolutely. And what I would add to that is, I think, touching on Paul's point just now and some of the other points made, is that I think the next stage of progress that would be most visible to the end consumer is prioritizing and building up a sort of cadence of use for core use cases, right? Because we can all build the technology, we can get the regulatory piece sorted, we can get the standards written, but ultimately if it doesn't serve the interests of everyday people and institutions who might need to use those IDs or those pieces of data in the provision of goods and services, none of this will go anywhere. So, I was talking with someone just over there in the waiting room just before we got on this panel, and I was saying, well, I would quite like to have my passport on my phone because then I could travel easier. She was saying, well, she's Australian. She was talking about the CDR in Australia, and I said, well, I don't think I know anybody who would turn down just having that one credential, your passport, on your phone and using it for a travel use case. You already have your travel tickets, plane tickets on your phone, have it sitting there next to it. And ultimately what happens every time you travel is you build up trust in the use of that credential for that specific use case. But it's one that matters to everyday people, and it's one that's of high value to most human beings. I think, going back to Gavin's point about being human in this process, right? It matters to us all. If you go for some of those more complex use cases that serve a very niche area, a very niche set of needs, then you won't get adoption. For me, the things that are required are, let's identify the use cases that are of greatest value. Let's make sure that they are very repeatable and that there's a high frequency of the use of data sharing mechanisms to fulfill that use case. Apple Pay, Google Pay you use every day. So now, as a use case, travel has become the main driver for the adoption of the Google and Apple Wallet. We could do the same for other credential types that government wants to put in. And then I think the third is there's got to be some understanding of what protections folks have if things go wrong. If I use my Apple Wallet or someone's stolen my phone and I call up a bank or whoever, I get refunded for the misuse of that particular tool for that use case. So once those three things are in place, I think that as humans, we might be able to get over this mental hurdle that we have to adoption today.
Yeah.
In digital ID is such a interesting one because I think what a lot of people maybe haven't grasped is that you can actually use it to reduce the amount of information you're sharing. So if you only need age, that's the only thing that can be shared, whereas right now you're sharing probably a lot more information just to get that age. So yeah, Adrian, I wanted to come back to you because of course digital ID is something that's going to have to interact across all smart data schemes. And I want to just bring us back to how you see interoperability and what should be harmonized to really make that happen?
Yeah, sure. So for us, it's all about putting the customer, the citizen, or the business owner in the centre of it all. So give them transparency and control over what they're sharing and who with. And this started with us for age assurance. So we can get through open banking your date of birth from your bank with your consent, with the security that your bank app gives you. And then we'll just share that you're over 18, yes or no, to the site. So the site doesn't know even who you bank with. Your bank doesn't know what service you're getting. There's a privacy layer in between, and we don't store the data. So it's all designed with security. So I agree with having your phone to be able to access things and prove who you are via your phone doesn't necessarily mean that my whole life sits on my phone, because then when it gets stolen, and the difference between my data and my payments is that payments I can get a refund. Data, once it's lost, I can't get it back. Someone's got it forever. So how do you protect against those things? And for us, it's flipping the model of today. Banks and most companies will collect data and then verify it. Do some matching process in the back end with a trusted source of data. With digital ID tools now, we've flipped that model on its head to say collect verified data. I know it's you, I know you're a real person, I know you're the right person, I know you own that data I'm collecting from you. And it's not just you that's presenting it. It might be signed by Lloyds Bank, it's signed by the government, it's signed by your telco. So I can check with those parties. And you're leveraging your existing relationships to create new ones. That's what it enables.
I think I'd build on that as well, and saying that's part of the market architecture that is enshrined in the Data Act.
Yeah.
What it articulates is that there needs to be multiple actors in the value chain, and that some of them never see the data, and that there's data minimization and data rights baked in at the ground level. And that's where one of the big challenges lies for regulators and governments and industry, as to where to set those boundaries of what rules are getting set by whom in which part of the market. That's a complex set of questions, even just within one sector, as we've seen in open banking's development over the last decades. When you go cross-sector, that gets even harder. So in the mix of this, I'd say that implementation is make or break. If we get the implementation wrong, we will create new threats and hazards and stuff for our citizens and from our customers, and we will open ourselves up to more liability and more cost and friction. If we get the architecture right, then it's all to play for, and we have a very positive future. So there's kind of two scenarios here that I think of in our future. We either create a critical mass or we create a critical mess.
Thank you, Gavin. So we are almost out of time. I want to give the opportunity for any final thoughts we haven't shared.
I think just to reinforce one of the points that's already been made, I think there is more energy in trying to solve the problems that we've been discussing for the last half an hour than I've ever seen in the last 25 years. And so I think it's a case of making sure that energy doesn't leave the table when you've got the people in the room, and actually, we continue to see some successes in this space.
So we have a lot of complexity, but a lot of energy and an enormous amount of opportunity, I think. So thank you so much to my panelists, and thank you.